Hi, today I'm going to talk to you about some more of the root causes of hunger. We're going to look at geographical barriers, acts of nature, and environmental degradation, and how those three things contribute to keeping the hungry poor hungry. The first thing I want to talk to you about are geographical barriers. And I want to first start by describing what a geographical barrier is. Typically, these are areas in the world that are impassable, or maybe there's a mountain in between a civilization and a people group, a rural village, maybe a river. Sometimes these can be weather dependent. For example, there are places in the state of Alaska where they're impassable during the wintertime, but in the summertime it's quite easy to get to them. So geographical barriers can be any number of things, but it's essentially a barrier in the geography of the land that keeps a place inaccessible to civilization. Typically, people that live in these areas live in isolation. It might be a very small village. Generally, these are rural areas. And typically, it's very difficult for a government to build infrastructure. Probably no power, no access to water or running water, impassable with roads, et cetera, et cetera. In our own country, in the United States, there are still areas in Alaska where there are homesteaders, which means that a family will be granted land by the government, but they have to build a livable structure on it. My sister-in-law is from Alaska, and one of her best friends grew up on a homestead, and they grew up without electricity, without running water, but building on the land within the place that they lived. When we look at geographical barriers, typically in especially poorer countries, there's a large prevalence of hunger and malnutrition. And a big reason for this is that people in those areas don't have access to larger foodstuffs. So if there is a crop failure, or if there's any sort of problem with the typical food source that they have, or any sort of climate change, these people will suffer greatly because there's no way to get them more foodstuffs. The picture and article that I pulled up on this slide talks about how in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, as part of the Andean mountain range, there's a large prevalence of malnutrition, and those are particularly in indigenous tribes. I think the quote on the slide says that half of the children of Andean countries whose first language is the indigenous language suffer from malnutrition. And that's generally because these are people that live in isolated villages that are very far away from the larger cities, and they don't have access to the resources that are the limited resources that the governments can provide, and are very susceptible if there's any sort of blight. We're going to talk a bit later about the Peruvian potato blight and that's effect on the culture and the food of some of these indigenous tribes. When we look at geographical barriers and people that live in places that are very isolated, they are typically very drastically affected by things such as natural disasters. When you have a major weather event happen, and you're already in an isolated place, it promulgates the problem and you become even more isolated. You also tend to see pretty extreme environmental conditions, so either very, very hot conditions or very, very cold conditions. It's difficult to access both for supplies and also for food, and you also tend to see lower educational levels in these regions, and that's typically because there's little to no contact with the outside world, and so people in these areas, there's not teachers coming in, and so they're not able to access the same education.